So today I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Andrew Pearce, whose illustrious career has seen him go from startup founder through to running global operations for one of the world's largest banks, and now leading thousands of technologists for what is one of the most cutting edge, innovative and recognized brands out there. So Andrew, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for taking the time out. So I wanted to start, because obviously there's a lot that we can unpack in this conversation, but I wanted to start by just understanding a little bit about how you would describe yourself as a leader.
For me, leadership's about motivating people to achieve something. And typically that something is beyond what they perhaps instinctively think they can do. So therefore, to me, the key dimensions are the ability to make a decision. So you need to be able to inspire people to make decisions. Perhaps that goes as far as to taking risks. So often people perceive making decisions as taking a risk. So I'm looking for people to make decisions, to be very sort of open, authentic, say it as it is. Because again, I think if you want to inspire people, you've got to be like that, and you need them to also be like that. And then finally, be prepared to embrace conflict. So use conflict in a constructive manner. And that perhaps might be a bit controversial, but one of the things I see, particularly in large organizations, is the companies use words like collaboration and stand-ups and all that kind of thing. And what it tends to do is push people to sort of want to get everybody on the same page in a very long and sort of conciliatory way. But actually that's kind of counter to rapid decision making. So in my view, you do need to promote a bit of constructive conflict. So in essence, you're saying you need people to be brave, you need them to make decisions, and you need them to actually be prepared to embrace a bit of conflict. So I see that as key elements of leadership and what I try to bring when I'm leading teams.
Mm. And how has your style evolved over the course of your career?
The main thing that's changed, I think, is the proportion of time I spend listening. I think when you start out, you tend to be very gung-ho. You're sort of just telling and you're not doing terribly much listening. So I think, when I reflect on what I do more of, it's I do more listening. Mm. I still make decisions as quickly, but I do it, I think, with a bit more input, a bit more listening to others, rather than just totally sort of assuming I've got this.
Yeah, that really resonates. I think one of the things that we really try and kind of embed into our organisation is that ability to question and understand, because that enables you to influence, right? And
yeah,
I think without the understanding of the kind of nub of what you're talking about, you can rarely influence. And I guess that's the same for leadership. I know we've talked before about your kind of your commitment to a core set of principles as a leader as well. How much does that play a part in kind of what you do and how you do it?
It's a sort of a foundation. And I think if you have to stop to reflect and think about that, then maybe you're sort of not embedding your core principles. And for me, you need to be completely open, honest with people. Trust for me is sort of a non-negotiable. And I think in many organizations that they lose the element of trust because they get worried about how people will react to being told the truth. Sometimes you sort of get these crazy conversations where people say, oh, but what if our competitors found out about this and that kind of thing? And it's like, they're all reasons for perhaps not full disclosure. And I think that's a problem. I think you have to be prepared to trust, and you have to be, therefore, completely transparent, completely honest with people. Now, back to my comment around constructive conflict, the challenge with being honest is sometimes people don't like to hear the honesty, if you like. They don't like to perhaps hear criticism or alternative ways of doing things. So you, by being open and honest, you also, in a way, have to be prepared to embrace that sort of conflict in a constructive manner, because you're putting forward ideas, you're perhaps telling people why there may need to be staff reductions or something along those lines. And so you've got to be able to face into what might be a conflict situation.
Of course, yeah. And I imagine there's quite a lot of sensitivity in a lot of the things that you do, which perhaps sometimes is contradictory to the whole kind of ethos around being really open and transparent, right? How do you deal with that in those situations?
I have a view that the revelation of, say, a corporate strategy and a competitor finding out about that is actually not a big risk, because the key is actually in the execution. So I think often organisations and individuals think that not sharing is a safer thing to do because they don't know where the information might go. But my view is that it actually, it's all about execution. It's not necessarily about just knowing. And so therefore we can probably share a lot more than we intuitively think is reasonable. That's sort of one observation. Yes, there are obviously going to be some things that are sensitive. Any organisation that's publicly listed, if you're doing something in the M&A space, you just legally can't disclose that. So I think that doesn't really create a conflict, and people really understand that sort of thing. But I think, again, it's about how quickly you are prepared to share. And again, in my view, the sooner the better, because I think trust cuts both ways, and trust then gets into motivation. If people trust the organisation and they trust their leaders, they're going to be more motivated to work for those leaders and to work for that organisation.
No, I definitely see that as well. Being open and transparent and having open comms around everything related to the business that you can possibly share, it does inspire people in a different way. Yeah. No, I see that. And so in terms of your approach to kind of developing and growing individuals that work underneath you, how do you balance that against, say, your own development and your own growth, or how have you balanced that throughout your career?
I've sort of managed my career on the basis of saying every job I've ever had, I've as quickly as possible groomed or developed a successor. That really is for two reasons. The selfish reason is it means you can go on to do the next thing. And the positive is that you're creating opportunities for other people. I was actually having this conversation with someone yesterday where I said, we need to make sure that the organisation sees you as my natural successor. So therefore, there are certain meetings that you should come to with me, and then once we've done the first couple, you then take over the management of those relationships. And so people are accustomed to talking to you about this subject matter, and I don't need to be involved.
Right.
That's a core way of developing others and ensuring that you develop yourself.
Of course.
Because there's nothing worse than sitting there and saying, gee, I'd like to promote X, or I'd like to give X this opportunity, but then you kind of go, well, hang on a minute. There's nobody to fall in behind if we were to take that person out of their current role. And so actually that curtails your ability to grow and develop, if that's the scenario.
Okay. And how do you identify that individual? Is it based on skill, experience, or behaviours, mindset, or a combination of all of the above?
To me, it does actually start with attitude. So while I do try to not just pander to the extrovert, because obviously extroverts tend to push themselves forward, introverts don't. So you've got to try to encourage views and feedback from everybody. But I am looking to see people who are prepared to sort of say, yeah, look, I'd like to be considered for this opportunity, or I'd like to be considered to be your successor, and then you work with them. So I try to get people to sort of put themselves forward, because I think that demonstrates, to start with, at least an attitude of desire. There's sort of no point in trying to shove someone into something that they don't want to do. So to start with, it's the attitude and the desire to do something. And then I think skills can be taught. So I don't tend to factor in skills as much, but I think once you've identified somebody, you then have to help them develop those skills. And so whether that's, as I say, exposure to other people, whether it's some training or what have you, it's giving them the opportunity to develop those skills.
Right. And is this based on experience from your perspective? And what I mean by that is when you look at your own trajectory in your career, it's obviously been really, really impressive, right? And unique in terms of the way that you've progressed and gone across different industries and across different functions within those industries. So have you gone through this process of being taken under somebody's wing and then learned through that process?
I have never sort of had what I suppose describe as a career coach or a specific mentor for a long period of time. But what I do is listen to what other people sort of have to say and cherry pick the wise words, if you like. And certainly when I moved out of the sort of the startup world into one of the large Australian banks, when I got my first sort of large line role, there was a guy there who was right at retirement age, actually, who was sort of effectively going to be a peer of mine on this leadership team. And he was the one that said to me, for you to be successful, immediately you need to identify a successor. That person needs to be able to take decisions on your behalf, 10 meetings on your behalf, because you just never know what's going to happen. And for your own career, you need to be able to respond to the things that are the most critical. And therefore, you need to have someone you can rely on to sort of do everything else. And I think he was sort of 64, 65, the end of his career, and he gave me that advice, and I've sort of lived by it ever since. And so every role I've got, I've literally zeroed in and said, okay, these are the people, and I'll try and narrow it down to one, and then literally make it very clearly known that if I'm not there, it's this person that you go to. And then typically that person then becomes a successor, and it then just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So when you move on, that happens. So I think that's one piece of advice that I got. The other piece of advice I got was say yes. and I know that sounds really trite, but pretty much that's how I've sort of built a career, particularly in larger organizations, because you'll often just be having a conversation with someone and they'll say, oh, look, there's an opportunity in the UK. Would that be something you'd be interested in? And yes. And it's amazing how then, the momentum then takes over and these opportunities come up. But I think that's one of the sort of the mantras I've lived by.
Yeah, you say try. I think I would say modest, if I'm honest. But it's it's really interesting to hear that. And so I guess in terms of your approach to then driving action at scale and how you enable teams to kind of come together, collaborate, have that conflict, but then drive outcomes out of the back of it. I think we've talked about some examples of kind of where you've done that previously within different organizations. It'd be good to explore that a little bit and understand, have you got a specific kind of methodology that you use to do that, or an approach that you use to do that?
My approach has sort of evolved over time, I mean, as you would expect. But I think first and foremost, you need to have a set of very easily explainable goals, and not lots and lots of them, but just a few that you can get people rallying around. So I think that's the first thing. And then you need to be confident that you can articulate and explain those the same way many, many times. And so what I've always done is really worked out fairly quickly when I've taken on a role, what are those sort of 3 or 4 things, and then just relentlessly driven that message. And so communication to me is exceptionally important. And so if you're leading large groups of people, don't ever be fearful of over communicating. So I do regular town halls. I do regular sort of skip level meetings with people. Lots of colloquial expressions, lunch and learns. Whenever I travel to different sites, I always get groups of people together. And the initial portion of those conversations is literally always just reiterating what those goals are, and then trying to elicit thoughts and views of people around, well, okay, how could we do it faster? What are the obstacles and that kind of thing? So to me, to achieve an outcome, you, as I say, you've got to be very, very succinct in being able to explain what the outcomes are and then just relentlessly drive the message. In terms of my sort of direct team and how do you get people to challenge each other and challenge me, I think that's actually often a little bit more difficult because you've got to create belief with people that it's a safe space. And different people have different risk profiles and are prepared to take, if you like, career risk more confidently than others. And so I think over time, and you know, you've got to do it as quickly as you can, giving people confidence that they can challenge, that's super important. And I think the way you do it is by showing examples of where you might say, I think we should do X. What does the group think? And then if somebody says, well, actually, no, I think we could do it a different way. If you can role model saying, yep, that's a good idea. Okay, you know, I agree with you. I need to do that 2 or 3 times. And then everybody will start to say, actually, okay, we can challenge. And if they're comfortable challenging you as the leader, then usually they become then comfortable challenging each other.
Yeah.
But it takes a little bit of time to get that in place.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's difficult sometimes to not want to lead from the front as well, I guess, right?
If I look at the different roles I've done, when I've walked into teams that are sort of already high performing, you have much more of a listen only mode where you know you start by listening more carefully, and it's not about wholesale change, it's more perhaps about adjusting. Whereas if you're going into an area that the reason you're being asked to do the role is because it's underperforming, then I think you do have to make decisions a bit more quickly.
Right.
If you're going to make, if you rapidly identify that the leadership needs to change, then you need to make those changes quickly.
Right.
And I think where you often see people fall down is they don't make the changes quickly enough, and they end up tolerating underperformance for too long. And when they finally realise the ship has sailed, sort of thing. So I think, you know, you've got these 2 different circumstances: a high-performing environment, listen a lot, you're adjusting, you're not radically changing. Low-performing, you perhaps have to be a bit braver and make some pretty significant change pretty quickly.
Right. It almost seems like a clearer set of responsibilities when you go into the lower-performing environment. Right? Do you generally, or have you found that historically? Or I guess, what would be your preference? What do you find easier, kind of eking out those marginal gains, or actually going in and doing wholesale revolutionary change?
Being able to make more radical change in many ways is actually easier. It's the old adage that if you're going to take over a coaching role in a sporting team, it's probably easier to take over something that's not performing very well, because you can, you know, the only way is up, if you like. Whereas you're going to a really high performing team, it's like, wow, this is, you know, how do I eke out those marginal gains? But I think certainly more of my career has been in the turning around an underperforming environment.
Right.
But in one of my more recent roles, which was a sort of an enterprise-wide change program for a very large company, it was a start from scratch exercise, which was somewhat unique. So I had to build a team from scratch, and then drive that change. And so that was neither sort of a wholesale turnaround or a marginal gains thing. It was sort of almost in between. And it's the first time in my career that I've ever been able to build a senior leadership team totally from scratch. And it was very interesting because I literally was able to sit there and say, okay, what I can do is build a truly diverse team. You know, whatever your measure of diversity is, if you like, I kind of put it in the pot. And what it showed me was that the results we achieved over 2 years, which was the very, very accelerated time frame, The results we achieved were significant and a lot better than I'm sure we would have if it had been an exercise of taking over an existing team and just tweaking it or even radically changing it. That ability to sort of build from scratch was great.
I guess it comes back to the why and having a really clear view on what the outcome that you're driving at is, right? Interesting. I can completely see that. And so, look, we've obviously talked a lot about kind of how you do what you do. Are there any specific obstacles that you've faced, or what are the biggest obstacles that you've faced in your career, and how have you overcome those?
Let me give you a couple of examples. Early on in my career, so about 10 years in, I suppose, I spent 7 months trying to negotiate a joint venture in Singapore to create a services business that would cover most of Southeast Asia. And I invested enormous emotional energy in it, and the potential partner was a very large company operating out of Singapore. And everything was going really well, and we needed one final sign-off from their chief operating officer, and he wouldn't do it.
Right.
So it was kind of 7 months of effectively complete conviction that this was the right thing to do for both organisations. Sort of 7 months of that just thrown out without a sort of second glance. I think the key thing for me was to actually be able to just talk to a few people, and the resounding thing that I got was, this is a great example of it's not personal, it's just business. What I took away from that was, you got to bring it back to that. So often you tend to take things personally, and I think that makes you a good employee because you care enough to take something personally. But you have to be really careful when it doesn't work in the way that you thought it would work, that you don't sort of translate that into a whole lot of self-talk about, your own inadequacies or injustices of the world or any of those kind of things. It's all about just sort of saying, okay, I've just got to get on with this because it's not personal. So that was one example. And then another one, I had a sponsor in an organisation that I joined, and this person recruited me into the organisation, and they have a very strong personality. And so those of us who were sort of recruited into the organisation by this person were deeply associated with them. Right. And when they left the organisation, where I assumed incorrectly that, okay, well, I'm that person's sort of, or one of that person's designated successors, so therefore I would assuming would be considered for their role. I wasn't asked, and another person was appointed out from outside, and what became clear to me was that the reason I wasn't considered was because the sort of the impact that my sponsor had on the company was so strong that they were frightened to have more impact like that. The thing that I sort of the injustice I felt was that the assumption was that I would be exactly the same as that person, and at no point did anyone talk to me about it or anything like that. But again, it came back to sort of saying, well, hang on a minute, this isn't personal, this is business, and these things happen, and you're just going to have to move on. There is no point in lamenting the situation, just move on. Yeah. Now, I know that's easy to say, but I think in order to be resilient, you do have to often divorce the business from the personal, because if you leave it enmeshed, it can just cause you a lot of anxiety. It drags you down. So if you're able to sort of get that mental separation, I think it's much easier to just move through challenges and move over obstacles that come up.
Right. Yeah. So you're effectively saying that your success as a human being isn't defined by your success in the workplace, right? Do you find that applies as much when things are going well as it does when you're facing challenges? Are you still able to leave work at the door, so to speak?
Yes, it's interesting because one of the development points that I have and that people have been telling me for many years is my reticence to overtly celebrate success. And so I think in many ways, one of the downsides of that separation is I kind of, business is business, and you work hard at it, and you have successes and you have failures, and you drive really hard, and then your personal is personal. But if you seek to protect yourself on the downside, often you fail to embrace the upside as much. So one of the things that I definitely tell myself I need to work on is that when you have a success, share it, talk about it, let people know you really appreciate what they've done and all that kind of thing, rather than sort of say, great, now what's the next thing? Yeah, and that's just as I say, it's a development point that I've had for a very long time.
Yeah, it's an easy trap to fall into, right? I guess. How much do you sweat the small stuff?
So when I take over a team to start with, particularly one that's underperforming, I do sweat the small stuff, because it's often the small stuff that's caused the problems in the first place. People have missed key details. But once I can get through a couple of cycles of that, and I understand what the small stuff is, and I can put in place the sort of the natural successor and that kind of thing, then I extract myself very quickly. And then I expect others to know the detail. I do subscribe to the theory that the devil's in the detail, because so much of technology and operations is about getting the detail right. If you build an application and you release it to customers, and 20% of the customers find it doesn't work, it's because there'll be some issue in the detail, not at the high level. The high level design and stuff will probably be fine, but it'll be in the execution and in the detail. So you do have to understand the detail to start with. But then once you've got your team and you're comfortable that they know what to look for, then you can extract yourself.
So once you've built that trust, and you trust that other people have got an eye on that detail for you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, I don't like the detail, but I know it's a necessary evil to ensure that you can turn things around and improve performance.
So an interesting thought that just popped into my head as we were talking there, and I've thought this many a time in the past, is, we're talking about leadership as one thing, really. And you mentioned technology operations, but again, you talk about it as one thing. How important is the division of responsibilities across a leadership team?
When you're starting out, when you've got a team, and particularly when you're sort of trying to turn around the performance, I think it's super important that everyone understands exactly what their role in the team is, how they can communicate their role to their teams, and that kind of thing. That's really critical. As you become more accustomed to working together and the team starts to function better, then actually you get to the stage where everyone knows each other well enough and knows how they're going to react in certain situations, that you actually can get a bit more shades of grey, and so you can have one team member speaking for multiple members of the team, and even making decisions on behalf of multiple members of the team, because actually now you're working together really well. And so that division of responsibility can become a little bit blurred. But I stress the word little, because you just don't want a free-for-all.
Yeah.
If you look at very small companies, like that sort of the startup space, I mean, everybody's doing everything because you just have to. And the division of labour and the division of accountabilities and much more rigour around role clarity and stuff becomes more important as the organisations get bigger. Right. But I do think that as a team matures in its ability to work together, then you can have a bit more shared. But to start with, I think it is very important that everyone understands their role, understands their key deliverables, what their accountabilities are, and you build from there.
Yeah, there's a key pattern in what you're saying, right? Because I guess you need that focus on the detail, and you need specialist skills to be able to really understand that detail. And as you start to progress from there, it becomes less and less important, or less and less of the priority.
That's
I
right.
suppose.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Okay, cool. And then so in terms of your own personal profile, I mean, one of the things that's really, I mentioned this to you previously, but you said something to me in one of our early conversations that really struck me, which was around your kind of cycling that you do outside of work. And you talked about cycling for hundreds of miles, and actually the biggest limitation being that your phone battery would run out, so you wouldn't know where you were. And that to me, it struck me on a number of levels, but it kind of demonstrated the level of drive and tenacity that must be kind of inbuilt and baked into you. Where do you think that comes from, and how much do you think that plays into the career that you've had?
Where it plays in significantly is in that resilience space. I don't give up, and so I will keep going in the face of challenging odds. I'm not stupid, so I if something needs to be stopped, I will stop it. But I do think that I'm comfortable embracing the expression, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so, I will just drive to get some outcomes, irrespective of the barriers in front of me. And I think there's an element of that with cycling. There's the next hill, you just have to get over it. You're going to go from A to B, and B involves 5 hours and lots of meters up. You just have to do it, and so you do it. And it might not be pretty, and there might be some, challenging moments of self-talk, but you get there. And so I think that's probably where the crossover is. It's around that resilience.
Yeah. Do you ever pat yourself on the back at the end?
Not as much as I probably should, but but sometimes, you get that adrenaline high when you finally got there. That's sort of,
No, it's fascinating, right? And clearly, it's I think going back to it again, your career in itself is unique. There aren't that many people that can do it, and I think it must be down to behaviours as much as it is down to kind of skill and knowledge and everything else, right? And experience. But cool. Well, look, that's really kind of helpful to understand. I think the last thing from my perspective that I wanted to dive into was just around your transition into technology. Clearly, coming from outside of technology previously and now running global teams of technologists. How have you found that? Has it been tricky, and are there specific challenges that you've faced there?
The piece that's probably the trickiest is not having a underlying background in cutting code in the most simplistic sense. I have to place a greater element of trust on the experts in the team to tell me, yes, this is a good decision, no, this is not a good decision. Whereas in many other aspects, I would be able to rely on my own depth to be able to really dig into the potential pitfalls. So that's been a learning, particularly when it comes to the digital side of things. And my knowledge extends to how do you penetrate a market, how do you drive interest from a market using digital means, etc. But the actual building of the solutions themselves, I have not done before and have never done. And so I'm completely reliant on others to say to me, this is the right strategic stack to create. This is the way to do that. This is the order that we should do things in. Agile's appropriate for this, but actually we need a bit of a balance for something else. I'm very much, reliant on the teams to tell me that, and I can't sort of delve into my own sort of background of skills and experience to assess that. But the one thing that I sort of have innately is a strong commercial nose and a commercial acumen, and so I can instinctively say, well, actually, if that's the answer, it won't work because commercially this won't create a viable proposition. So therefore, the tech doesn't actually matter, because there won't be a customer at the other end. So you can build something, it'll be beautiful, but no one will buy it. So therefore, we've got to find a different way, and we've got to do something different.
Of course, yeah. Okay, makes sense. Okay, cool. And then the last thing to ask you before we wrap up. So if there was one thing that you knew at the start of your career that you know now, what would that be?
Probably celebrate success a lot more. Because that creates more enthusiasm within your teams and creates a greater sense within yourself of sort of celebration and happiness. So that's something I've learned to do over time, but it's taken me a long time.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. It's been great talking to you. I really appreciate your time.
Great, thank you.
Every time I manage to sit down with Andrew, I always leave feeling inspired, and this conversation was no different. I think the key thing that he talked about, which really kind of impacted me personally, was the need for a successor within the role that you're doing. And actually, he talks about this being one of the key priorities for him when he lands in a new role, finding and nurturing a successor. And when you think about that, it's obvious, really, that enables you to start elevating within your own role. Once you've got that person there that can deputise for you, it gives you the freedom and the time and the ability to then start really adding value and kind of doing the additional stuff you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And also, then you can start to look forward to what's next for you personally. I thought that was fascinating. The second thing that Andrew talked about, which really resonated with me again, was his hobbies outside of work and his passion for cycling, and how he's kind of translated that into what he does within his role as well, and within his professional career. He talked about there always being another hill that you need to climb, that you need to get over to get to the end goal. And again, when you look at leaders generally across the board, there seems to be a real consistent theme that a lot of leaders are heavily engaged in physical activity of some description and always want to push themselves, both within what they do in work, but also outside of that. For me personally, I find that quite inspiring and something that I'd like to go away and make sure that I'm doing and implementing into my day-to-day life.